General George Patton sat across from Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson on May 7, 1945. Germany had surrendered hours earlier. American soldiers were celebrating in the streets of occupied Europe. Patterson had come to Bavaria to discuss the future. Patton leaned forward. He spoke with the clipped intensity that had carried his Third Army across France in 90 days. "Let's keep our boots polished, bayonets sharpened, and present a picture of force and strength to these people," Patton said. He meant the Russians. "This is the only language they understand and respect." Patterson tried to explain the big picture. The American public wanted peace. The alliance with the Soviet Union remained essential. The war was over. Patton wasn't finished. "If you fail to do this, then I would like to say to you that we have had a victory over the Germans and have disarmed them, but have lost the war." Patterson asked what Patton would do about the Russians. "Keep the U.S. Army in Europe intact," Patton said. "Delineate the border with the Soviets. If they didn't withdraw behind it, push them back across it." The conversation ended badly. Patterson reported back to Washington that Patton didn't understand political reality. Within months, that May 7th conversation would look prophetic. Within 7 months, Patton would be dead. The question wasn't whether Patton wanted to fight the Soviets. The question was why he saw what his superiors refused to see and what it cost him. May 1945 marked the end of the most destructive war in human history. The Third Reich lay in ruins. Hitler was dead. The Wehrmacht had surrendered unconditionally. Allied forces controlled Germany from the Rhine to the Elbe. Soviet forces held everything east from the Oder to Moscow. The Grand Alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was fracturing before the guns went silent. George Patton had earned his reputation the hard way. North Africa in 1942, Sicily in 1943, France in 1944, the Ardennes in December 1944 when he pivoted the Third Army 90 degrees in 48 hours to relieve Bastogne. By May 1945, the Third Army had captured more than 80,000 square miles of territory and inflicted more than 1 million casualties on German forces. Patton understood combined arms warfare better than any American commander in Europe. He understood logistics. He understood how to read terrain and exploit enemy weakness. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had predicted the Battle of the Bulge when everyone else called it impossible. What Patton understood about the Soviets came from direct observation. On May 13, 1945, Patton entertained the commander of the Soviet Fourth Guards Army at a luncheon in Linz, Austria. Protocol required formal recognition of Allied cooperation. Patton decorated the Soviet commander. They drank heavily throughout the meal and afterward. The Russian went out cold. Patton walked out under his own power. He wrote in his diary that night about what he had seen. "They are a scurvy race and simply savages. We could beat hell out of them." The following day, Marshal F.I. Talbekhin, a Soviet Army Group commander, returned the courtesy. He tried to get Patton drunk. Patton described him as a very inferior man who sweated profusely. The Russian soldiers put on a tremendous show. They passed in review with a very good imitation of the goose step. But Patton was watching more than military displays. American prisoners of war were coming home with stories that contradicted official narratives. POWs liberated by Soviet forces reported treatment worse than what the Germans had given them. Soviet soldiers had stolen their watches, boots, and rations. Officers who protested were beaten. Some were shot. Patton's intelligence staff compiled reports from across the occupied zones. Soviet forces were dismantling German factories piece by piece and shipping entire industrial plants back to Russia. They were installing communist puppet governments in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. They were arresting anti-communist resistance fighters who had spent years fighting the Nazis. The pattern was unmistakable. On August 8, 1945, Patton wrote in his diary about the difficulty of understanding the Russian. We do not take cognizance of the fact that he is not a European but an Asiatic and therefore thinks deviously. We can no more understand a Russian than a Chinaman or a Japanese, and, from what I've seen of them, I have no particular desire to understand them except to ascertain how much lead or iron it takes to kill them. In addition to his other amiable characteristics, the Russian has no regard for human life and is an all-out son of a bitch, a barbarian, and a chronic drunk. The words were harsh. The assessment was tactical. Patton was evaluating an enemy he expected to fight. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower saw the same evidence Patton saw. He reached different conclusions. Eisenhower had spent 3 years building the Grand Alliance. He understood that defeating Germany required Soviet cooperation. He believed that cooperation could continue after victory. Eisenhower thought like a future president. Patton thought like a warrior. The strategic situation in May 1945 created the divide. The Yalta Conference in February had established occupation zones for Germany. Berlin would fall within the Soviet zone. Prague and Vienna were negotiable. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wanted Western forces to push as far east as possible before the Soviets consolidated control. Churchill had been warning about Soviet intentions since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. He had allied with Stalin out of desperate necessity. By April 1945, Churchill was frantically sending messages to President Harry Truman and to Eisenhower. He wanted Berlin taken by Western forces. He wanted Prague secured before the Red Army arrived. On May 12, 1945, Churchill wrote to Truman describing an iron curtain drawn down upon the Soviet front. The phrase wouldn't become famous until his Fulton, Missouri speech in March 1946. But Churchill saw it clearly in May 1945. Patton and Churchill thought alike on this question. The enemy hadn't changed. The enemy had simply worn a different uniform during the war. Eisenhower rejected Churchill's proposal to take Berlin. The military cost was too high. American casualties would be significant for a city already allocated to the Soviets by international agreement. The political cost of breaking that agreement would damage American credibility. Patton disagreed. In late April 1945, Patton claimed he could take Berlin in 2 days. General William H. Simpson, commander of the Ninth Army, shared that assessment. Eisenhower denied the request. After Patton finally reached Berlin in July, he wrote to his wife on July 21, 1945. "Berlin gave me the blues. We have destroyed what could have been a good race, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages. And all Europe will be communist." It said that for the first week after they took it, all women who ran were shot and those who did not were raped. I could have taken it had I been allowed. The strategic question wasn't whether Western forces could have taken Berlin. The question was whether taking Berlin would have changed what came after. Patton believed it would have. He believed that military reality on the ground created political facts that negotiations could not overcome. The American public in May 1945 loved Uncle Joe Stalin. The media portrayed the Red Army as heroic liberators. For years of propaganda had established the Soviet Union as America's gallant ally suffering terrible losses to defeat fascism, which was true. Soviet casualties numbered in the millions. The Eastern Front had destroyed the bulk of the Wehrmacht. But Patton was looking forward, not backward. He was evaluating the Soviet Union as it existed in May 1945, not as American propaganda portrayed it. Soviet ground forces outnumbered Western forces in Europe by significant margins. Intelligence estimates suggested the Red Army maintained approximately 264 divisions on the German border. American and British forces combined mustered approximately 103 divisions, including 23 armored divisions. The numerical advantage was roughly 2-1 in Soviet favor. Patton dismissed the numbers. He told Under-Secretary Patterson that the American army as it existed in May 1945 could beat the Russians with the greatest of ease. While the Russians have good infantry, they are lacking in artillery, air, tanks, and in the knowledge of the use of the combined arms, whereas we excel in all three of these. If it should be necessary to fight the Russians, the sooner we do it, the better. The assessment wasn't entirely accurate. Soviet artillery was excellent. Soviet armor had improved dramatically. The T-34 remained one of the best tanks of the war. But Patton was correct about combined arms doctrine and air superiority. American forces in 1945 possessed overwhelming air power and superior coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. Patton also understood logistics. The Soviet supply system depended on captured German resources and American Lend-Lease shipments. Their supply system is inadequate to maintain them in a serious action such as I could put to them, Patton told officers. They have chickens in the coop and cattle on the hoof. That's their supply system. They could probably maintain themselves in the type of fighting I could give them for 5 days. Whether Patton's assessment was correct became a theoretical question that remained unanswered. Winston Churchill commissioned a study in May 1945. British military planners developed Operation Unthinkable, examining the feasibility of forcing Soviet forces back to pre-war borders. The plan assumed Western forces would attack on July 1, 1945 with the 64 American divisions, 35 British and Dominion divisions, 4 Polish divisions, and theoretically 10 German divisions available in Europe. The German divisions were imaginary. After the mauling they received from the Soviets, German soldiers weren't eager for another war. At best, the Western forces would field 103 divisions against 264 Soviet divisions with 6.5 million troops. The British study concluded that Western forces could advance but could not achieve decisive victory without enormous casualties and extended conflict. Churchill quietly shelved Operation Unthinkable. It remained classified for decades. Patton never saw the study. He drew his own conclusions from his own analysis. His superiors dismissed those conclusions as the fantasy of a brilliant tactical commander who couldn't grasp political reality. By August 1945, Patton's anti-Soviet views were creating problems for Eisenhower. American policy required maintaining the appearance of Allied unity. The United Nations was being established. The occupation of Germany required four-power cooperation. Every statement Patton made about Soviet barbarism undermined official policy. Eisenhower was receiving pressure from Washington to control Patton or remove him from visible command. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. Germany required denazification. Allied policy mandated removing former Nazi Party members from positions of political, administrative, and governmental power. The policy made sense in principle. In practice, it created chaos. Under Hitler's regime, anyone who wanted to keep their job had been compelled to join the Nazi Party. Teachers, postal workers, civil servants, engineers, factory managers. Membership in the party had been required for employment. Removing every former party member meant removing virtually everyone with experience running Germany's infrastructure. Trains stopped running. Utilities failed. Local government collapsed. The bureaucracy that made modern society function disappeared. Patton was responsible for Bavaria as military governor. He had to rebuild German civil society from ruins while simultaneously purging Nazis. He concluded the policy was unworkable. Many people had joined the party for pragmatic reasons, not ideological commitment. Germany couldn't be rebuilt without using former low-level Nazis who possessed necessary expertise. On August 11, 1945, Patton wrote to Eisenhower suggesting they go more slowly on denazification. Too many trained administrators were being removed. Too many inexperienced officials were being put into office. Eisenhower reminded Patton that obliteration of Nazism was a major United States war aim. Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067 specifically prohibited retaining Nazis for administrative necessity, convenience, or expediency. Denazification was a most delicate subject both here and at home, which newspapers and government representatives have been quick to seize upon. Eisenhower warned Patton in writing on September 11, 1945. I know certain field commanders have felt modifications to this policy could be made. That question had long since been decided. We will not compromise with Nazism in any way. I wish you would make sure that all your subordinate commanders realize that the discussional stage of this question is long past, and any expressed opposition to the faithful execution of the order cannot be regarded leniently by me." Patton didn't back down. On September 22, 1945, after a routine morning briefing at Bad Tolls, Patton agreed to answer questions from reporters. When asked why Nazis were being retained in governmental positions in Bavaria, Patton gave an answer that ended his career. "I despise and abhor Nazis and Hitlerism as much as anyone. My record on that is clear and unchallengeable. It is to be found on battlefields from Morocco to Bad Tolls." He paused. Then he said the words that newspapers would quote for days. "This Nazi thing is just like a Democrat and Republican election fight." The comparison was reported as Patton minimizing Nazi atrocities. The reaction was explosive. Members of Congress demanded his removal. Newspapers that had praised his battlefield genius condemned his political judgment. Editorial pages asked how America's most aggressive general could be so naive about the evil he had fought to destroy. Eisenhower had saved Patton before. In Sicily in 1943, Patton had slapped 2 soldiers in field hospitals, accusing them of cowardice. The scandal nearly ended Patton's career. Eisenhower had intervened, forcing Patton to apologize but keeping him in command because his tactical brilliance was irreplaceable. This time was different. The war was over. Tactical brilliance no longer outweighed political liability. On September 28, 1945, after a heated 2-hour meeting with Eisenhower, Patton was relieved as military governor of Bavaria. On October 7, 1945, he was relieved of command of the Third Army. His farewell remarks to his staff were brief. "All good things must come to an end. The best thing that has ever happened to me thus far is the honor and privilege of having commanded the Third Army." Eisenhower transferred Patton to command of the 15th Army, a paper organization responsible for compiling historical reports on the European campaign. It was a desk job. For a man who had led 500,000 combat veterans across Europe, it was exile. Patton knew what had happened. Eisenhower was preparing for the political stage. Every misspoken word Patton uttered undermined Eisenhower's credibility. The denazification comments provided the excuse. Everyone understood the real reason. Patton's anti-Soviet views were politically impossible. American policy required cooperation with the Soviet Union. Patton's warnings threatened that cooperation. His removal silenced the most prominent American voice calling for confrontation with communist expansion. In early December 1945, Patton met again with Undersecretary Patterson. 7 months had passed since their May conversation. Patton hadn't changed his assessment. He predicted the Soviets would maintain permanent occupation of Eastern Europe. They would spread communism through Western Europe. Military confrontation was inevitable. "We're going to fight them eventually," Patton said. "In 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, we'll wish we had done it in 1945 when we had the chance." Patterson listened politely. He told Patton that Washington had no interest in confrontation. The American public wanted peace. Patton's warnings were politically impossible to act on. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton went pheasant hunting near Mannheim. He sat in the back of his 1938 Cadillac Model 75 staff car with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. Private First Class Horace Woodring drove. The morning was cold and clear. At approximately 11:45, Woodring drove across a railroad crossing on Mannheimer Strasse in the Mannheim suburbs. An army truck turning left into a depot struck the passenger side of the Cadillac at low speed. Gay suffered minor injuries. Woodring was shaken but unhurt. The hunting dog ran away. Patton struck his head on a metal partition separating the front and rear compartments. The impact broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. Army medical personnel evacuated him to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg. Doctors determined he had suffered a cervical spinal cord injury. The prognosis was grim. Complete recovery was impossible. Survival was uncertain. For 12 days Patton fought. He showed some progress. Doctors discussed flying him to the United States for treatment. Then his condition deteriorated rapidly. On December 21, 1945, he died in his sleep from a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. Beatrice Patton requested he be buried in Luxembourg at the American cemetery near Ham. She wanted him to rest among the soldiers of the Third Army who had died at the Battle of the Bulge. On Christmas Eve 1945, 17 Army cannons fired a salute as Patton's flag-draped casket was placed on a train. Locals removed their hats as the procession passed. A horse with boots reversed in the stirrups followed the casket to the cemetery. The circumstances of Patton's death fed conspiracy theories that persist decades later. The timing was suspicious. 3 days after warning Patterson about Soviet intentions. Less than 3 months after being relieved of command. In an accident that killed no one except Patton. Official investigations concluded the accident was exactly that. An unfortunate accident. Private Woodring's account remained consistent through decades of interviews. The truck driver's statement matched. Military police found no evidence of foul play. Patton himself, immediately after the accident, absolved both drivers of responsibility. But suspicion lingered. OSS officer Douglas Bazata claimed decades later that he had been asked to arrange Patton's death. He provided no credible evidence. Authors have suggested Soviet NKVD involvement. They have suggested Eisenhower's complicity. They have suggested that Patton knew too much and said too much and threatened too many powerful interests. The historical record supports the simpler explanation. Patton died in a car accident. Random chance, not conspiracy, ended his life. What matters isn't how Patton died. What matters is what he saw before he died and what it cost him to see it clearly. Patton understood in 1945 what American policy wouldn't acknowledge until 1947. The Soviet Union wasn't a temporary ally against Hitler. It was a totalitarian empire expanding westward. Stalin had no intention of honoring agreements about free elections and democratic governance in Eastern Europe. The Red Army would not voluntarily withdraw from occupied territories. By March 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, warning that Soviet domination stretched from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. By 1947, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, committing the United States to containing Soviet expansion. By 1948, the Soviets blockaded Berlin. By 1949, NATO was formed to counter Soviet military power. Everything Patton predicted in May 1945 came to pass. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. Communist expansion globally. The Cold War that lasted 45 years. Millions who died under communist tyranny in Eastern Europe, China, Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere. Whether Patton's proposed solution would have worked remains unknowable. Whether attacking the Soviet Union in 1945 would have prevented the Cold War or simply started World War III cannot be answered with certainty. Military historians debate whether Western forces could have pushed Soviet armies back to pre-war borders. The atomic bomb, tested in July 1945, changed the calculation. American possession of nuclear weapons provided leverage that might have forced Soviet concessions without direct military confrontation. But the United States in 1945 couldn't use that leverage. The American public had just endured 4 years of war. Over 400,000 Americans had died defeating Germany and Japan. The idea of immediately fighting another war against an ally was politically impossible. Soldiers wanted to go home. Families wanted peace. The industrial mobilization that had sustained the war effort was being dismantled. Patton's tragedy was being right at the wrong moment. He saw in 1945 what others wouldn't acknowledge until 1947 or later. He proposed action when it might have succeeded. He was silenced before he could be vindicated. He died before he could say, "I told you so." The generation of American leaders who rejected Patton's warnings went on to fight the Cold War he had wanted to prevent. They spent 45 years and trillions of dollars containing Soviet power that might have been broken in 1945. They watched Eastern Europe disappear behind the Iron Curtain. They fought proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam. They lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation for half a century. None of that proves Patton was right about fighting the Soviets in 1945. It proves he was right about the Soviets being the next enemy. The question of whether to fight them immediately or contain them over decades was answered by circumstances and by leaders who chose containment. Patton never received official recognition for his strategic vision. His reputation suffered from the denazification controversy. Popular memory preserved his battlefield brilliance but forgot his warnings about Soviet expansion. The 1970 film Patton portrayed him as a warrior out of time, unsuited for peace, which was partially accurate, but it missed the substance of what Patton saw and why it mattered. Modern historians increasingly acknowledge that Patton's assessment of Soviet intentions was more accurate than the assessments of his superiors. Documents released after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 confirmed Stalin's plans for permanent occupation and communist expansion. Soviet internal communications showed contempt for Western naivete and determination to exploit wartime agreements. Patton wasn't a prophet. He was a soldier evaluating an adversary. He looked at Soviet behavior in occupied territories and drew conclusions about Soviet intentions. He understood that military force created political reality. He believed that Western military superiority in 1945 provided a window of opportunity that would close. He was almost certainly right about the window closing. By 1949, the Soviet Union possessed atomic weapons. By the 1950s, Soviet military power had rebuilt to levels that made direct confrontation unthinkable. The strategic calculation that Patton made in 1945, fight now from strength, became impossible within 5 years. Whether the United States should have acted on that calculation remains one of history's great counterfactuals. We know what happened because we didn't. We can't know what would have happened if we had. What we know is that one American general saw it coming. He warned his superiors. He paid for those warnings with his career and possibly with his life. And the threat he identified consumed American foreign policy for half a century after his death. On July 21, 1945, Patton wrote in his diary, "Another war has ended and with it my usefulness to the world. It is for me personally another very sad thought. Now all that is left is to sit around and await the arrival of the Undertaker and posthumous immortality." 5 months later, the Undertaker arrived on a cold December morning on a railroad crossing near Mannheim. Patton was buried among his soldiers in Luxembourg. His grave marker is identical to those of the men who served under him. No special monument, no elaborate memorial, just another white cross in rows of white crosses. His warning about the Soviets was buried with him for 2 years until events proved him right. By then it was too late to act on the warning. It was only possible to vindicate it. The Cold War vindicated Patton. But vindication came at the cost of everything he wanted to prevent. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, communist expansion across Asia, proxy wars that killed millions, nuclear standoff that threatened civilization. Whether fighting the Soviets in 1945 would have prevented that outcome cannot be known. Whether Patton's assessment was strategically sound remains debatable. But the central fact is undeniable. Patton identified the Soviet Union as America's next enemy before almost anyone else in American leadership. He was willing to say it publicly when saying it cost him everything. That combination, seeing clearly and speaking honestly, made Patton valuable in war and dangerous in peace. Wars reward clarity and courage. Peace rewards diplomacy and compromise. Patton excelled at the former and failed at the latter. The question isn't whether Patton wanted to fight the Soviets. He made that abundantly clear in conversations, in diary entries, in statements to reporters. The question is whether he was right to want it, and whether America missed an opportunity by refusing to listen. History suggests Patton was right about the threat. History doesn't tell us whether he was right about the solution. That answer disappeared on December 9, 1945, on a railroad crossing in Mannheim when a truck struck a Cadillac and broke the neck of the general who wanted one more war. The irony is profound. Patton survived North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He survived the Rhine crossing, the Battle of the Bulge, and the drive into Czechoslovakia. He survived 3 wars and countless battles. He was killed by a traffic accident 12 miles from his headquarters during peacetime. The warrior who wanted to fight the Soviets died without firing another shot. The general who warned about communist expansion died before the Cold War officially began. The soldier who understood the next threat died before his superiors acknowledged he was right. Patton wanted to fight the Soviets. Whether America should have fought them remains an open question. Whether Patton paid the price for raising that question is not. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. If you want to hear more forgotten chapters of history, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Drop a comment telling us which WW2 story you want to hear next.